So really the floor is yours to come forward. There's a microphone there. And move in that direction. If you really prefer to sit, just raise your hand and we have somebody who will bring a microphone to you. That's even more convenient. With this, thank you, Alison, for asking the first question, which is a relevant one. So if we have all this IoT in our environment, and it's all stored in the cloud, or much of it is stored in the cloud, how does that work? What happens if your Wi-Fi connection drops? And first Jari, and then Piers, I would love to hear your opinion too.
Yeah, so I wanted to say that it's the cloud solutions are definitely not sufficient. I mean, they're widely used, but it's not the only thing. And also I think you mentioned efficiency also there in terms of the communications. That's a consideration, but maybe not the primary one. Like independence from breaking internet connections is a better reason, or your ability to control your own destiny or your own data is a much better reason. But of course, what mostly drives this cloud development is that it's so easy. Like even for techies that usually have servers in their basement, like I do, and I actually use cloud services nowadays mostly because it's so convenient and everything works easier from that perspective. It's much easier development environment. But there are distributed architectures, and I also wanted to mention that there are also cloud providers that can provide you with some more sort of a local solutions and your ability to sort of control where your data is in terms of the locality and exact level of control that you have on the platforms. So I think it's a bit of a sort of a requirement issue that if you demand that you want a better solution than you can get for your largest and greatest cloud provider from some other part of the planet, then you could actually get it.
Does it make sense to you, Piers?
I just wonder, was the full question asked?
Can you tilt the microphone a little bit?
Sure.
So you point at your...
I have to point it at myself.
That is perfect.
Right. So I'm on stage. I just wonder if the full question was asked, because behind the question as to whether it's efficient is whether that's the real reason that the way that the technology has been designed is simply to turn on your washing machine, or is it because, as we know, in many cases it is to capture data. Now, the question therefore is not whether it does it, but whether the user is, first of all, aware of that, and two, is happy with that, has given consent implicitly or explicitly. And I suppose that's where we need to be, because I wouldn't dare argue with an engineer, but I still have to say that, of course, the cloud is itself a distributed system. And we have increasing use of edge computing, which, as we develop 5G, as we develop the 5G platform, including some of the low-power technologies, the WAN, for example, that was described, the edge computing will be a critical part. And then it won't be a question of, should I allow my data go onto the edge, which is part of the cloud. It will be necessary for integrated systems, particularly in mesh operations. But I think what we need to drill down to immediately is the user aware that their data is being sent to the cloud and therefore out of their control? Are they consenting to that? But of course, from a policy point of view, the European Commission would certainly encourage the use of data. If we can just take the working example that Alison has given, there are lessons that can be learned in aggregated data that can be useful for useful grid management, energy saving, etc. What time of the day is it normally done? Can the system ping you back and say, wouldn't it be better if you waited for 2 hours? But also that for ecological reasons, we could have a better understanding of power consumption. So I think that's really, particularly when we're talking about human rights, is what we need to decide, because whether it's an engineer or a regulator, we'll always find good reasons for the cloud to be used.
Yes, very much. Thank you, Peter. I can see you were triggered by this.
Yeah, cloud is an appealing word for data protection experts. But I fully agree and subscribe to what Mr. Pierce said. But I just wanted to add one more element, which is legally makes even more complicated this issue. This is the localization, the localization of the cloud. Where is this cloud based, and what are the guarantees that it can provide? Whether if it's contractual, whether if it's legal, hard obligation, soft obligation. And it really complicates or can complicate legally the use of this technology.
Yes, thank you very much. It's just also a discussion catching up with reality now, because we didn't used to do things in the cloud that much as we do it now, or the last 3 years even, I would say. And industry is often developing ideas for different reasons. One of them could be to catch the data, which is an example, but other things can just be to provide a service. A very clear example there would be the Samsung TVs that collect in their cloud your commands, so they can compare it with other commands and understand what you say. It's never intended to spy on you, yet these data are out there. And I think industry becoming aware of that and of the potential impacts of such issues is one of the things we go through while technology will continue to evolve. So, please introduce yourself and then welcome your question.
My name is Jutta Kroll. I'm coming from the German Digital Opportunities Foundation, and I would like to pick up something that Alison has said with regard to smart farming and the monitoring of the animals' health. And you had questioned whether this is linked to human rights, and I would say the same technology is applied to monitoring people's health. And when it comes to children, for example, we already have these Internet of Things or Internet of Toys, stuffed animals monitoring the health of the children. And then it is, of course, a question of human rights, whether this infringes the human rights of the child, but also whether it's safe to have these data transferred to the cloud. So I really would like to discuss whether we have, under the principle of safety by design or security by design, other options as to not to transfer these data, these health monitoring data to the cloud, but maybe transfer them in other ways, because I think it's good for parents to have the opportunity to monitor the health, but on the other hand, they need to be aware of the risks for the safety of the data and then also for the safety of the child. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for your question, which is very relevant. It's being aware of it, and also technology supporting that it can happen in a secure way. So security built in is an important question here. One of the examples I saw in my travels was that you can also bring your parents when they get Alzheimer or whatever to a home where they're monitored 100% of the time, and you can even put on and off their gas, their stove, their water. You can witness that, and it's I've seen this beautiful American-style commercial where it's like in heaven, and you can always interfere and help them out when they get into trouble because of losing. So, what does that do to you? My first reaction was, "Shit, I don't want that." And then you start to think deeper, and then you think of quality of life of people that otherwise might be stuck in a home with closed doors where they can't walk out because, and without the proper care. And then you see that balance. It's this kind of thinking why we need the debate. Can we secure these things in a proper way so we can do this safely, we can feel good about it? What way forward here? Piers, I know there is a human-centric element, as you explained this morning in the main room. How do we deal with this?
Well, I think the answer has to be that we can control it, but if we have a purely technological control, then we're going to lose, one way or the other, some of the benefits of the technology. So we actually have to have greater design, which is tailored to the human, but also rules with regard to the intervention. So to go back to the question about health, and particularly about toys, Now, we can be accused, of course, of being naive, but the European Commission's starting point is, of course, we have now strong data protection regulation, which must be implemented. And if it's not implemented properly, well, then obviously there's a problem with regard to our basic approach. So we have to be very careful about that. But any data about a child or any other subject where it is personal or can be related back to that individual subsequently, probably using technology, then that is personal data and must be protected. So that's not an answer in itself, but it is using these approaches that in terms of the device, but also the service and the transmission, we have to assume that if we don't know otherwise, we have to assume it's personal data and that it must be protected. But then in your application where certainly we can say here is a positive use, here is a potential to facilitate individuals, and another well-meaning and well-intended individual will of course be reassured, but also to help that individual. But if that device without the proper controls falls into another set of hands, then maybe you could have a less benign use of that same technology. So there again, of course, at the end of the day, if you leave it purely to technology, we will have pressure to put blocks. So we won't be able to use the technology and therefore protect some people, protect children or protect vulnerable elderly people. But they won't be able to benefit from the technology either. So that's the society. That's actually why we're talking about human rights, because it's subjective and it is a societal problem that cannot be solved by regulation or regulation alone.
Thank you very much. Makes a lot of sense. Jari, can we be sure? Can we depend on systems?
I'm optimistic about the technical aspect of this. Like you can actually secure things fairly reasonably, but that doesn't solve the policy issues. Like, I mean, even if we have a perfect system, you and your parents still need to decide whether you want to have them monitored, and it's sort of a trade-off at the policy or human level. I mean, are they capable of deciding for themselves or not, and the downsides and the upsides, and that is still there even if the technology was there. But I did have a comment on this sort of technical discussion and following up a little bit on this data localization and whether we allow toys to put data on the cloud. I think it's not only about like the physical location of things or physical location of the data or where the cloud is. It's sort of the logical access to the data. So, I mean, as an example, you might have some webcam that you can, like when you're out of home, you can follow what's going on at home or with your parents, for instance. But the question is who has access to the data or the picture or the video feed? Is it you? And maybe that's a different question than, and if it's you and some corporation that will store it, or maybe it doesn't store it, but some friendly intelligence agency will store it for 50 years, and then 40 years from now, after 13 changes in the administration or presidency or whatever, the political climate is different 40 years from now. And then, maybe they want to use the footage from 40 years ago, from your childhood, or something, and that scares me.
I can see that. Yeah.
I don't know if any of you saw the WikiLeaks recent release of Vault 7, which was about CIA, because we were probably referring to third countries, maybe which are less. Pro individual rights, but even Western countries have been producing malware that has been targeting IoT. Yeah.
Yes. No, thank you. I'll take a couple of questions from the room now. I've got somebody at the microphone, and I got somebody who asked for the microphone in the room, and we'll take a couple of questions. Then we get back to the panel. I know Piers has to leave in 10 minutes, so if you have specific questions for him, this is also the time to ask it. He won't leave because he's bored. He leaves because he has an appointment with somebody else. So please, you're standing, so I would say you go first, right? Can you introduce yourself, Ian?
Yeah, Ian Fish, BCS Chartered Institute for IT in the UK. There was a lot of, and it, rightly so, bottom-up technical stuff talked about, as well as some top-down. But I look at things from a system of systems point of view, including the human, and that's where the human rights thing comes in. So I'll start. I've just got a couple of questions or points. I think they're more like questions. I'll start with Peter.
You get two at most, Ian.
Yeah, two. I'll do two then. Right. So the first is around the issue of that the data subject must be aware of the data which is collected on them, and that really came to my mind when Piers was talking, because he talked about the digital divide, and I thought really we've got a different sort of exclusion here, which is an exclusion based on information that about the data subject that they may not even know is there. And the question really is that sort of thought right or not? So, and how does that apply to the human rights of the person? And the second question is, and again, Peter mentioned it, nobody else had before, which was ethics. So when you come to what Piers talked about, elderly people, and you've all talked about it now, about how they can be helped and all the rest of it, really, are we in a situation now where, because of the possibilities that are now there, that actually ethical questions come right to the top of the pile when dealing with what is possible against what is desirable? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I invite you to ask your question too?
Thank you.
Can you?
Is there a sound? Sound? You can hear? Okay.
What is your name, please?
My name is Osman Coşkunoğlu from Turkey.
Welcome.
Academician and former politician. I was late, so if my question has already been touched upon, I apologize in advance. There is industrial internet consortium. I believe University Exeter is a member of that consortium, if I'm not wrong. In industrial area, industrial Internet of Things, people are, this is not because I endorse it, I'm just mentioning it as a reality, people are much more sensitive for the security of their data against industrial espionage compared to human rights and other ethical issues. What do you think about that consortium's work? In fact, a couple of months ago, they published in Industrial Internet Security Framework Technical Report. I analyzed it. It looked good, but if the principles put there, the guidelines put there, can it apply to daily Internet of Things? Is the question that I have curious about, number one. Number two is, very briefly, IPv6, without IPv6, is it possible at all to have Internet of Things? It's a very specific question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There is one more question coming, and then the question here in the middle, and then it's really back to the panel. Please.
Thanks, Martin. Robin Wilton from the Internet Society. I wanted to put forward a couple of points for the panel to think about. The first one is about the effect of the Internet of Things on the amount of data that is generated about all of us. We already know that much of what happens on the Internet is fueled by personal data, which is monetized, and that as an economic force powers much of what happens on the Internet. And often that's to the detriment of privacy. To my mind, the Internet of Things represents a huge increase in the amount of data that's generated about us, with or without our awareness. And I'd like the panel's views on the likely impact of that on personal privacy. And then just one quick point about identity. I think IoT radically changes the way in which we need to think about personal identity, in this sense, that if I'm surrounded by a cloud of intelligent or connected devices, it creates a pattern about me uniquely, from which it's almost impossible for me to escape. So what are the prospects for anonymity and pseudonymity when we're all surrounded by that cloud of connected things? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Interesting questions, please.
Hello, my name is Seamus Simpson. I'm an academic at the University of Salford in Manchester. I'm a colleague of Alison's on the project on technical standards for internet governance. My particular concern on that project is spectrum. And my question to the panel concerns capacity, essentially, for the Internet of Things going forward. So we've been told for many years the future is mobile. I guess the present is mobile, but it seems to me that a lot of the Internet of Things will rely on microwave technology to at least some extent. But we're also told that spectrum is scarce, and recent debates about spectrum at the global level have highlighted tensions between the desires of the mobile communications business to have more spectrum and resistance to loss of particular parts of the spectrum by broadcasters in particular that underscore the public interest dimension of their ownership of spectrum. So my particular question is, into the future, to what extent is there going to be sufficient spectrum capacity, particularly at the local level, to deliver the Internet of Things in a well-functioning, broadly accessible way? And to what extent might that put pressure on the idea of spectrum as a public resource that could be used for purposes of an experimental nature or a civil society nature? In other words, are we going to see an increasing proprietization of spectrum by the private sector in the interests of the delivery of the Internet of Things?
Thank you for that quite different but very appropriate question as well. Just grouping it, we've got some questions on security, on ethics and data protection, and the more technical questions on IP version 6 on identifiers on one side, spectrum on the other side. And obviously, the data subject must be aware from Ian, which is like, can we opt out in the IoT space? I think if we move towards, if we want to do anything with this, systems need to be secure. And I recognize very much that there's a difference between the gadgets, the domotic environments, the cyber-physical systems, and if you go to the consumer side or go to the industrial side. I think you've also been involved in that. You're aware of the industrial security report?
So I have personally not been super involved in the industrial internet efforts, and there's multiple, but I have a general observation to make, which is that since I worked with industrial use cases and some enterprise use cases and compared that with consumer market situation, and there's one very clear thing that these people, like you have a factory to run, you have an industry to do, you have a company that you care for, you actually have people to think about stuff and set requirements, and they do think about these kinds of things, privacy and do we have security to access the data forever and not just for as long as the other company or the service provider is available. So and they usually demand more than the consumers. So they say, we need, okay, that's a very nice solution, but we need the data here under our control. Now they might outsource their data center also, again, somewhere else, but they usually want things under their control. And that's primarily, I think, a difference of, of course, the requirements may be harder, but it's also a difference of knowledge and time to think about stuff and being in a market position where you can demand more things. Because if you buy some millions of euros worth of equipment, you can set some ground rules. Whereas you're a consumer, you could not buy that thing or buy that thing. I mean, those are pretty much your options.
Yes, unfortunately, we also see that consumers are often not aware of the costs of security or lack of security.
Right.
And industry is more aware. And with that, Piers, I know this will be your last remark, so please start on this, but if you have any remarks on the other aspects, do that as well, and appreciate your opinion here.
Well, thank you, and I'm sorry for disrupting the discussion, and I would really like to stay. It's just unfortunately somebody else's diary didn't fit that way. I think on the question of the industrial internet, the Commission is strongly supporting the development of the industrial internet. The Commission is putting money into helping industry to develop the platforms that you're speaking about. We have absolutely no embarrassment about that, and it's absolutely no surprise that they don't first of all think about human rights. So let's not, I know that you weren't trying to do so, but there is a risk of the discussion being polarized. What we can do, as is so often the case, is benefit from the investment and the thinking that industry has done and say, well, that technology will work for protecting the individual as well. One issue about Internet of Things, which goes back to the digital divide, however, is that, of course, because this data is worth money to them, these processes are worth money to them, they will spend more on the devices. They will spend more on system security and even on the quality of the individual device. And to have the Internet of Things benefiting everybody, we have to find ways of, well, how through mass market, but also through common action do we drive down the cost? Because many individuals will buy the cheapest model in the bulk retailer, and that is the one probably with the lowest security profile. And that's the way the market works. So there is a role for regulation, but we can't force it because somebody will always want to meet that price point, which is lower, and cut corners to get there. Just about the IoT environment, yes, I think it is realistically not possible to cut yourself off anymore from this environment, but that's why the General Data Protection Regulation and the security rules must apply. Consent is crucial, but as those who are less well educated or in a less favorable social environment or economic environment come into the internet, they must be given the tools, and that's where we have a social policy objective. I'm really going to throw out two more answers now. One on IPv6. Simply, the Commission feels that we must move to IPv6 and that IoT will not develop properly. I will stop there because it's a discussion in itself. On spectrum, I would say, however, that the problem is not any longer the broadcasters. It's already moved on. It's too late for them. They've realized it, and some of the broadcasters are very proactively working now for wireless and mobile cellular type approaches to their work. For IoT, we will need a strong mixture of licensed and unlicensed spectrum. And we have to go more towards spectrum sharing, which is something which we have been doing already for some years, where there are clear examples of how that works. And again, whether it's low power or low data rate, huge numbers of these IoT devices do not have to be always on with very low latency and with very high debits. They might be signaling quite intermittently. So that kind of usage pattern means that with modern technologies, but also with clever spectrum planning, we can actually accommodate all of the uses. And that's something which we do have a role with the member states. So allowing an individual undertaking to own a huge amount of spectrum is not actually going to help because it does use up. But there are many other technologies which actually push us in the other direction, which is why those who do own exclusive use spectrum are being forced more and more to justify that and to actually, in some cases, even allow low power, localized applications to actually run below a certain dB on spectrum which they are using for high power cellular technologies. So all of this is happening. The biggest problem that we see is resistance from member states who still see spectrum as a cash cow for their exchequer and who do not actually realize that if they were to free up spectrum, to lower the price of spectrum, they would actually be creating growth in their own economies.
Thank you very much for...
And I apologize for leaving.
No, thank you very much for your contributions, and it's very good and clear to hear that also the social, the privacy, and even the policy accounts are very much at the core of the work the Commission is leading on IoT. So thank you very much for your contributions. Peter, please fill that other chair, otherwise it looks like a gap there. Yep. So, Peter, on this.
Yes. So several issues have been raised. So I try to give some of the answers our committee would have or would found out during its work, because those questions have been pop up in our work regularly. So ethics, yeah, I mean, with the pace of the development of this technology, ethics is becoming more and more important. And I think in this ethical council, there are in European countries, there are national ethical councils who can play a very important role in this. We should, what kind of use of the new technology can be or cannot be undertaken. There are international forum as well for this. For instance, there is at the Council of Europe, the DH Bio, which is the bioethics committee, who is actually presenting a white paper on the use of new technology in nano technology, genomics and biomedicine, and all this field. So I think the ethical questions are becoming more and more important, and national and international bodies have to play a role in deciding or in giving guidance on the use of this technology. Anonymization. Well, I think this is one of the basically the major change in data protection or in privacy, that of course the legal texts are speaking about anonymization as a desired result, and it's speaking in a technically neutral way, and it is right to do so. But in the practice, a lot of practitioners find out that anonymization is not possible anymore, and is not effective anymore, and pseudo-anonymization is even less effective. So now we are tending to measure this as how much effort it takes to re-identify the person and have this kind of meter or have this kind of parameters for to decide whether if it's lawful or if it's unlawful. So if it takes too much time, too much effort to re-identify a person, then maybe it will not pose legally problems. But if it's very easy, it can be done. It can be done by the combination of very easily obtainable results or methods. Then it might pose problems. Information and right to information. This is one of the core principles when it comes to data protection and privacy. As I said, the data subject has to be aware of the whole life cycle of its data. And well, of course, we are departing from the principle that the data processing has to happen for legitimate purposes. And if the purpose is legitimate, and I mean the data controller is bona fide, it has to inform the data subject on what is he or she doing with his or her data. And if it's not happening in an understandable, simple way, well, it is clearly illegal, at least under European regulation. Yeah, I will stop.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, no, it's very clear that as you said, the concern with data is, can you anonymize them? In a world where big data is brought together in all kind of algorithms and analyzed in context of other data that were never intended to be combined before. So it's a very good question. At the other side, we also see, also in Europe, the recognition that data are also valuable, not only to businesses, but also to society. So how can we make use of that? How can we use open data in a useful way? These are very relevant questions. They go beyond a little bit the IoT subject, so we'll take that to the 2 o'clock session in this same room, which is more about data. If we go back to this session, one point I wanted to ask your attention for, I don't know whether it fits in what you have in your mind right now, but what we also see in the Internet of Things is from the gadgets and talking about the different parts, we look more and more to what is referred to as cyber-physical systems. For instance, Picasso project, it's looking at specifically that, as that changes the context of the discussion, it changes the context of the spectrum discussion, it changes the context of where do you localize your data. A cyber-physical system is a system that contains a lot of IoT. It could be your car, it could be your house, it could be a plane. In a way, logically, it could even be a city. It's coherent. So where do you keep the data? How do you secure the data is different there too. So is that helping us to start thinking in this kind of concepts? And in what way? Jari, I saw your... And you know, you can always give the answer you planned rather than the question.
Yeah, I had sort of a set of things in my mind from the questions and discussions. So first thing on my mind actually was that we talked to, I mean, naturally we're here, but we talk about EU things, but I just want to point out that the world is global, and a lot of companies, I know my employer is on that mode, so we want global solutions. We want to go to the global market, and you know the standards are global. So let's keep that also in mind, that this is where we have to have an effect. It's not enough to have an effect on our own continent. So just want to get that out of the way. And Piers already answered the questions on IPv6 and spectrum, I think, more or less perfectly. I just wanted to add a couple of small things there. So, I mean, obviously it's possible to do things in multiple ways. I think the IPv6 is the future, and today's reality also in many cases, and that's the right way to do things. It's possible to tweak systems so that you can do things with v4, but it costs more and it will use more power. And it's not the desirable state of affairs, particularly for things where you need to contact a sensor or actuator and expect to do that in a quick time scale. Spectrum, he already answered pretty much this, but I just wanted to add that there are some trends in terms of like making the cell sizes smaller and the range is smaller, and so it's a denser architecture, and you have also beamforming techniques in 5G. So I mean, some of this works against the trend of having more and more gadgets and devices using this capability. So this kind of balancing parts of this, I'm personally optimistic about the spectrum parts. And then back to your cyber-physical systems, I think it is a helpful way to think about stuff. I mean, you can't have like this, look, here's a car and then there's some IT stuff to go along with it, but we're not responsible for the IT stuff in any manner. That doesn't really cut it. Like, you have to think about the whole. Like, this is the service and the product that we're offering. These are the rules, and we are responsible for these parts, and in the warranty, you as the consumer are responsible for this other one. I mean, that's the way to think about the whole. It's not along the axis of technology somehow.
Alison, please. Please go ahead.
I just have one last thing to say on, I think you were getting about...
Could you aim it at your mouth?
Sorry?
I was told to keep it above your heart and
Right.
don't cover the antenna, so this is perfect.
Is it okay now?
Yes.
Okay. About, you were getting at data localization attempts, because a lot of European states in particular are pushing for data localization, particularly financial data. And the verdict is also not really out on consent and definitions of consent. A lot of people are referring here to the General Data Protection Regulation, but we have coming up the revision of the e-privacy directive now at the European level. And IPv6 is very important in this and the Internet of Things because, of course, identifiers and devices can be identified as well as people, and they're looking at MAC addresses as identifiers, whether they should be identifiers or not, and also more regulation on cookies and third-party cookies and so forth and so on. So the verdict isn't out on consent, and also there's pressure because the cloud is regulated in the point where the server is located, on where servers should be located and regulated and whether they should be subject to European law or not.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to ask, can you, there's some remote questions? Rachel?
No remote questions, but I have a question.
Oh, then it's you first and then it's Rachel. Please introduce yourself.
Great. Annette from the Internet User Organization of ICANN, the European organization. I think, Alison, your question has not been answered yet. Can devices be locally managed? I really would like to have an answer to that because I like the idea also of having a server in the basement. That is one thing. The other question is, listening to all of that, it seems that data ownership is really central. And what we discuss here right now looks like a huge disappropriation. I looked that up with the help of my friend over here, and Eignung in German. Having had a socialist country in the past, this does not really sound like a nice word to us, appropriation. So taking away the ownership of your property via technology, especially as in agriculture, for example, or in many other places where the peasant does not own the data anymore of its soil. I don't like that idea. So, and if we listen to my neighbor here who says we look at industry and there they make money and so they really care about security. So is security depending on the costs and the profits you make, and what does that mean for the security when I'm the owner of the data, and is it still secure?
Okay, thank you. Can you give the microphone to Rachel?
Yes, hi.
Unfortunately,
we don't have any remote questions, but I as I said, I have a question.
You can ask
Rachel, Rachel Pollack from UNESCO. So I wondered if we could go a little bit deeper into the discussion of impacts on human rights. Of course, we all think about privacy and data protection, but I wonder if in your work and discussions you've come across any examples of impacts on other human rights, of freedom of expression or association, or social, economic, and cultural rights like the right to education. Does IoT only offer potential negative impacts on human rights? Are there any examples of where you think that it actually can help achieve human rights? Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for these questions. One thing on price, it's also, are consumers willing to pay for privacy? And so far, commercial companies find they're not. They're going for the cheapest, not for the safest. And where you put the responsibility and the liability is a good question. Can you internalize it in the price, basically? And on Rachel, for sure, obviously, one of the human rights is to be fed, to have enough food. Eradicate hunger is one of the things. And this is not a problem in Europe, but indeed, if you take it even to a higher global level, I can see that we need IoT for these kind of things, or to be safe, as the tsunami warning system now will give a head warning when a tsunami would arrive, enabled by the Internet of Things. So there's clearly examples there too. With that, I would ask you, there's a clear data question here. On data ownership is a concept that's often misunderstood. Can you explain that and bring also your perspective on how to deal best with that? And then the other question, of course, also about the local management, which is a slightly more technical question, but I can see the value of that also in this context. Robin, I'm not sure we'll be able to get to your intelligent cybernetics question. Just wanted to point out it's really important for the future, but we'll take that if we manage to do this in 3 minutes. Peter.
Well, generally speaking, there are two right to information. I will start by this, and we'll come to data ownership. So right to information is usually is a twofold obligation. It's a general obligation for the data controller to inform, in general, what kind of data processing he's undertaking. And there is specific obligation when it comes to a request for information from a data subject on his or her specific data. And this is where the two rights are interlinked. The right to control the data and to be in control of the data, and the right to information. They are interdependent, so they cannot live or exist one without the other. So this is why they are equally important. Our solution or our suggestion is to, in our very rapidly changing world and in a very complex data processing activities and which are going on, is to make sequences of the data processing activity by the controller, and to contact or to inform in advance and to have the consent or contractual agreement or other legal base for data processing, and to have to each sequence of the data processing. We know that it is more cumbersome, and then it requires more energy and from data controller, but we think there is no other way around.
Yes, and on ownership, data ownership, you were going to say something?
Well, it's about the data. Who owns the data?
Yeah.
Well, I think I passed this.
Oh, that's fine, and no problem. Thank you for this clarity that consent or at a legal base, right? Basically. So, thank you. Listen. Jari, there's two questions here. One was whether also local management would help. Very explicit question.
Yeah. So the local management. I think we have different kinds of systems or applications, and certainly you can have local management and local services and under your full control. And we should actually do more of that. I mean, there's some, as I mentioned earlier, there's some work at the IETF going on to do some of that. But I do want to point out that there are distinctions between different types of applications. So you can have some of these things like the light control in a house or whatever inside, sort of inward-facing thing. But there's also outward-facing things or applications. And typically, if you allow other people to connect to you or your resources in some manner, then that probably implies some kind of a rendezvous function in the infrastructure or globally accessible rendezvous function. Now that could be in one central point in the cloud, or it could be more distributed. But there is this distinction between the different types of applications, that some can be totally localized, and some are just by their nature, they are global, that you have to allow people from the other side of the planet to connect. That cannot be done. So, merely from your basement and no connections anywhere and so forth. So there's probably going to be some infrastructure. Now how you do that is maybe the question mark. But I just wanted to point out that difference.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, thank you for that. I think if you take into account that this world is changing and that will continue whatever we do, it's debates like this that make us more aware of the issues that really touch upon our lives deeply and how we want to go about it that are important. This is also why in the IGF, IoT is one of the focal points of one of the dynamic coalitions. And what we said here will be taken to the global IGF as well. Important to take. Then I think we can we have 2 minutes left, so a little bit look through to the artificial intelligence question. But basically we see that IoT is permeating our environment. Our world is becoming increasingly digitized, which makes the digital world very close to the analog world in a way, in observation. But that world can act as well. I'm still wondering what happens if the world around me decides what's good for me without me having anything to do about it. When we talked about this last year in the IGF Guadalajara, Vint Cerf was there, and in my innocence, I suggested to go back to Asimov and adopt his 3 laws for robotics for our environment. That it's in the first place there to protect human beings, second place to protect itself, unless that goes at harm of human beings, etc. And then Vint looked at me and he said, but there's also a 0 law, and that is the interest of humanity. I took that with me and made me realize that if my existence in this world may be at cost of humanity, and a higher intelligence based by endless data streams finds that out and decides to act on it, I'm not sure I would like it, even if it's better for humanity as a whole. But with this fault, it shows that it's important that we keep understanding what's happening around us. And maybe that things like local management of data, thinking in terms of cyber-physical systems rather than in light bulb X and connector Y will help us to do it. That it will also mean that we really need to look at security from the outset. And a comforting thought there was that there was a Philips inventor of Philips Hue. Who knows what Philips Hue is? I didn't know either. I thought it was his name, but I knew better because he introduced himself. But Philips Hue is the name of an intelligent lighting system where you can influence with your phone, of course, your interface, whatever, the intensity of lighting, the color of the lighting, on, off, etc. And he said, even for the light bulb, we consider the security aspects, and we invite hackers to try to hack it and work with it. Open source is where they move towards. And it's an interesting thought because being a little bit aware of IETF, although I'm not an IETF engineer, whenever they think of how to solve something, there's one obligatory paragraph in the report, please correct me when I'm wrong, which is about the security aspects. And it's not good enough to say, security you solve in other ways. You have to explain the risks and how that works. With that, I think we come to a good fundamental management of our environment as much as we can, a context that we're beginning to understand better and better. That doesn't mean all the solutions are there, because all the stuff that we've been installing over the decades and will continue to be installed may be designed on entirely different principles. And it will be in our environment too, and it will be sharing data. So with that, I would like to thank really you for your contributions and your thoughts to the process. I'd like to thank you for your participation, your good questions, and I wish you a tremendous rest of your day. If you want to talk about data, back in this room at 2 o'clock, and as you know, there's other things on the program as well. So thank you very much.